Hello, my name is Alan Borst, and I am the administrator of the Creative Writing Program at the University of Utah. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the second of three virtual public events that comprise our 2021 Borderlands Conference. Today, we host Fernanda Melchor and Eduardo Halfon for a reading and moderated Q&A and discussion. Later today at 12 p.m. Mountain Time, all four of our Borderland guests, including Cristina Rivera Garza and Julian Herbert, will participate in a roundtable conversation. I'll post a link to these event details and registration information in the Zoom chat momentarily. We will also be recording all of these Borderlands events and make those recordings available on our University of Utah English Department YouTube channel. Please note that we invite you to submit questions in English and Spanish via the built-in Zoom Q&A feature throughout the program. In order to post a question or view other attendees' questions during the event, you should click on the Q&A button along the bottom of your Zoom window. Before I turn things over to our Borderlands organizer and host, Michael Mejia, let me take another moment to note that as part of the Guest Writers series, the Borderlands Conference was made possible through the University of Utah's English Department and received funding from the Salt Lake County Zoo Arts and Parks Program and Utah Humanities. Utah Humanities empowers groups and individuals to improve their communities through active engagement in the humanities. This series is also supported in part by the Utah Division of Arts and Museums, with funding from the state of Utah and the National Endowment of the Arts. Thank you to the University of Utah's Center for Latin American Studies. Thanks also to creative writing graduate student Aristotle Johns, who will be introducing Fernanda Melchor later in the program. Without further ado, I present Borderlands Conference organizer and host, Professor Michael Mejia.
Hola y bienvenidos a todos. Greetings from my desk in Utah, from which I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael Mejia. I'm a professor at the University of Utah in the English department, teaching in the creative writing program, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this event today. Before we start, for those of you who weren't able to join us last night, some brief context for this conference. The first Borderlands Conference was conceived in the wake of a presidential election that sought to depict immigrants from Mexico as violent criminals. That conference took place in spring 2019 following a midterm election that framed Central American migrants fleeing poverty, climate change-related crop failures, and rampant gang violence as an invading horde. So in short, there was an urgent need for a critical and creative discussion here about the space of the borderlands, a space we share not just with Mexico, but with Latin America, our immense and culturally rich neighbor with whom we share a surname. Our initial group of authors, Yuri Herrera, Francisco Cantu, Natalie Sender-Zapico, and Antonio Ruiz Camacho's works were focused quite directly on the US-Mexico border and on migration. And this year's lineup shares some of that focus, but our authors also connect the narrow geographical space of the border to a much wider world of internal and global migration, from marginalized subpopulations to Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, as well as to the nomadic wandering of artists, academics, literary works, and language itself. Again, I want to thank you all for attending today's event, and I want to thank our four authors for crossing borders of time, space, technology, and language to share their work with us. So our first reader this morning will be Fernanda Melchor.
Hi, everybody. Hola y bienvenidos otra vez a todos. Welcome, everyone. It is my distinct honor today to introduce Fernanda Melchor and her work. On the first page of Fernanda Melchor's Temporada de Huracanes, hurricane season, the reader walks alongside a group of 5 young boys as they discover the dead body of La Bruja, the witch, floating in a village canal. Through the rest of the book, the whole rhythmic and torrential rush of it, We are exposed to a plurality of internal voices as we get closer to finding out what actually happened to La Bruja. It is Melchor's authorial bravery that asks us to contemplate this body, and it is the bravery of her language and the bravery of her spirit that pushes us further, beyond this one body, to interrogate a broader system of extreme violence that impacts countless bodies every single day. In writing Hurricane Season, Melchor said, quote, "I wanted to understand the darker side of my own soul," end quote. By the end of Hurricane Season, our souls too feel implicated, like we've joined Melchor to uncover essential bits of humanity found somewhere in a network of violence and hatred and pain. To do so, Melchor uses her youth growing up around Veracruz, Mexico, her background as a newspaper editor and a writer of crónica, which is a sort of literary style of journalism. But her work also transcends any easy description or any easy delineation of borders. Genre in Melchor's work are defied and then redefined. Styles are mixed and changed. Melchor creates a language entirely of her own that has the power and flexibility to move from village gossip to judicial proceedings in the span of just a single sentence. The virtuosity of her work opens our eyes to the painful realities of femicide and machismo and misogynist violence, and her writing is incredibly necessary. But Melchor's work extends just beyond Hurricane Season, a book that has received much deserved acclaim, like being shortlisted for the International Booker Prize in 2020, winning an English Pen Award, and then the Anna Seeger Prize as well. The English reading public is awaiting translators to bring Melchor's other books into English. These include Aquí no es Miami, Falsa Liebre, and Paradise, a book that just came out this month. But even in translation, Melchor's work sings. It animates and it flows, and the characters are so well wrought that they feel at times to be speaking directly into our ears. Reading her work, we are very fortunate to be reminded of the humanizing force of word and of story. So please today join me in welcoming another very humanizing force, Fernanda Melchor.
Thank you very much, Aristotle. And thank you, Michael. Thank you, Alan. Eduardo, it's a pleasure to be also here with you in this reading. My name is Fernanda Melchor, and I'm going to read a passage from Hurricane Season. I will love to ask for your forgiveness in advance if I make your ears bleed. I'm going to read a passage from Norma's chapter. Because one day, on her way home from school, Norma found a little paperback book with a ripped cover and fairy tales for children of all ages written across it. And on opening it at random, the first thing she saw was a black and white illustration of a little hunchback crying terrified while a coven of witches with bag wings stabbed the hunch on his back. And the illustration was so strange that, ignoring the time and the imminent rain, ignoring the dishes waiting to be washed, and her siblings who needed feeding before their mother got home from the factory, Norma sat down at the bus stop to read the whole story, because at home there was never time to read anything. And even if there were, she wouldn't be able to, with her siblings' racket, the blare of the TV, and her mother's constant yelling, not to mention Pepe's fooling around or the piles of homework that awaited her each night after washing the pots, which she herself had used at noon before leaving for school. And so she pulled the hood of her coat over her head and folded her legs under her skirt, and she read the whole story from start to finish, the tale of the two hunchback. That's what the fairy tale was called, and it was about a hunchback who lost his way one evening in the woods close to his home, dark and sinister woods, where witches were said to meet to do their evil deeds. And that was why the little fella was so frightened to find himself lost there, unable to find his way home, wandering blindly as the night fell, until suddenly he spied a fire in the distance, and thinking it might be a campfire, he ran toward it, convinced that he's been safe. So imagine his surprise when he arrived at the clearing with the gigantic fire, only to realize it was a witch's Sabbath, a coven of horrifying witches with bad wings and claws instead of hands, all dancing around the blazing fire in the most macabre fashion while they sang. Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday 3, Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday 3, Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday 3, and they were cackling their terrible witchy cackles and howling up at the full moon. And the hunchback, who, still unseen, had taken cover behind an enormous rock not far from the fire, listened to that cyclic chant and, unable to explain how, unable to explain the overwhelming urge that came over him, he took a deep breath as the witches sang their next Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday 3. He jumped onto the rock and shouted at the top of his lungs, Thursday and Friday and Saturday 6. His cry resounded with surprising force in that clearing, and on hearing him, the witches froze where they were, petrified around the fire that was casting horrible shadows on their beastly faces. And seconds later, they were all running around, hovering between the trees, shrieking and hollering that they had to find the human who'd said that, and the poor hunchback, once again crouched behind the rock, trembled at the thought of the fate awaiting him. But when at least the witches found him, they didn't hurt him as he'd imagined, nor did they turn him into a frog or a worm, or much less eat him. Instead, they took the man and cast a spell to conjure enormous magical knives, which they used to cut off his haunch, without spilling a drop of blood or hurting him at all, because the witches were pleased that the little fella had improved their songs, which, truth to be told, they were beginning to find a little boring. And when the hunchback saw that he no longer had a hump, that his back was completely flat, and that he didn't have to walk hunched over, he was happy, enormously happy and contented. As well as curing his hump, the witches also gave him a pot of gold and thanked him for having improved their songs. And before resuming their witches' Sabbath, they showed him the way out of that enchanted part of the woods. And the little man ran all the way home and straight to his neighbor, who was also a hunchback, to show him his back and the riches he'd received from the witches. And his neighbor, who was a mean, jealous man, believed that he deserved those gifts more, because he was more important and more intelligent, and those witches must be real fools to go around giving away gold just like that. And by the following Friday, the jealous hunchback has convinced himself that he should copy his neighbor. And as night fell, he entered the woods in search of that coven of cretinous hags, and he walked for hours in the darkness until he too lost his way. And just as he was about to collapse against a tree and cry out in fear and desperation, he glimpsed in the distance, in the thickest, gloomiest part of the woods, a fire surrounded by witches dancing and singing. Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday 3, Thursday and Friday and Saturday 6, Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday 3, Thursday and Friday and Saturday 6. And with that, the jealous neighbor scurried towards them and hid behind the same enormous rock. And on the next round of Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday 3, Thursday and Friday and Saturday 6, the vile little man, who despite believing himself more intelligent than his neighbor, was not the smartest of fellows, opened his mouth, took the deepest breath he could, cupped his hand around his lip and shouted, Sunday 7, with all his might. And when the witches heard him, they froze on the spot, petrified in the middle of their dance. And that dimwit of a hunchback emerged from his hiding place and opened his arms to reveal himself, thinking they all flocked to him to fix his hunchback and hand him a pot of gold even bigger than the one they'd given to his neighbor. But instead, he saw that the witches were furious, clawing at their chest and yanking out great clumps of flesh with their own nails, scratching their cheeks and pulling the flowing hair that crowned their horrific heads, roaring like wild beasts and screaming, who's the fool who said Sunday? Who's the grudge who ruined our song? And they got sight of the mean little man and zoomed towards him. And with hexes and jinxes, they conjured the hump they removed from the first man and put it on him. And as a punishment for his imprudence and greed, they placed it on his front. and instead of a pot of gold, they pull out a pot of words that hopped out of the container and immediately stuck to the body of the despicable man, who was left with no choice but to return to the town like that, with two humps instead of one, and warts all over his face and body, and all for having come out with this Sunday seven, the book explained. And in that final illustration of the story, the jealous neighbor appeared with those two humps, one deforming his back and the other one making him look pregnant. And that was the moment Norma finally understood how silly she's been to think that the fateful Sunday seven was the blood that stained her panties each month, because clearly what it referred to was what happened when that blood stopped flowing, what happened to her mother after a spell of going out at night in her flesh-colored tights and her high heels, when from one day to the next her belly will start to swell, reaching grotesque proportions before finally expelling a new child, a new sibling for Norma, a new mistake that generated a new set of problems for her mother, but above all for Norma, sleepless nights, crushing tiredness, reeking diapers, mountains of clothes covered in baby vomit and crying, unbroken, ceaseless crying. Yet another open mouth demanding food and whining. Yet another body to keep an eye on and care for and discipline when her mother returned to work, exhausted, as hungry, cranky, and grubby as the youngest of Norma's siblings. Her mother, just a child herself, who Norma had to feed and stroke and comfort, massaging baby oil into her callous feet and aching muscles, steeped from all the hours spent of her feet performing the same movements over and again at the sewing machines. And above all, Norma had to listen. Yes, above all that, listen to her mother's woes, her grumbling and gripping, the same admonishment as always. And she had to nod and agree and look her mother in the eye with a smile on her face and kiss her forehead and pat her back when she wept, because if Norma just could help calm her down, if Norma could help her unburden her chest, perhaps her mother wouldn't feel compelled to lock herself in the bathroom and scream that she wanted to die. Perhaps she wouldn't go out and get drunk looking for affection in the caress of a strange man, or let herself get hurt by those bastards who were all the same, bastards who pluck the moon and the stars from the sky from you, but then, when push comes to shove, toss you out like a filthy old rag. So don't believe them, Norma. Don't let them fool you. Don't expect them to look after you. Don't expect anything from those assholes. You got to be smarter than them. You got to demand respect because you give them an inch and they'll take a mile. So you better keep your wits about you. Use your head. Save yourself for a decent man, an honest, hardworking man who keeps his word, a decent man like Pepe, who won't desert you with your Sunday seven. And Norma will nod and say, yes, that's what she'll do. She'd never take any man at his word. She'd never let those bastards get their filthy way with her or do the nasty things they do to women only to ruin them. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Fernanda. Writing, Eduardo Halfon has said, comes from not knowing, from the no sé. The same, it seems, is true of motion, the compulsion to move on. It's a constant feeling of being outside, Halfon has said, of wanting to be outside. It's not a choice. I've just never felt that I belonged anywhere. Writing is emotion, of course, and perhaps we can imagine the perpetual motion of Eduardo Halfon, the writer and the narrator, as the composition of a singular book, a perpetual act of investigation, of working their way deeper and deeper into the unknown, the unknowable, the absence of knowledge, the presence of feeling, the no sé. Halfon, the writer, was born in Guatemala in 1971. When he was 10 years old, his family moved to Florida, fleeing the violence of Guatemala's decades-long civil war, which was then migrating from the country's western highlands into the capital. They'd established themselves in Central America only a generation before, having survived another genocide in Europe, a family history embedded in the number tattooed on Halfon's maternal grandfather's arm. His phone number, the old man joked. Though he shares much of his author's biographical data, Halfon the narrator, the persistent, almost unwilling protagonist of much of Halfon the writer's award-winning fiction, may in fact have been born on the afternoon that their grandfather told them the tale of the Polish boxer who saved his life at Auschwitz, a silhouette whispering through the night what to say and not say in order to stay alive. That is, the tale is shared, but the instructional text for survival remains hidden, unspoken. Or it is written and rewritten on the bodies and in the text Halfon the narrator perpetually pursues throughout Halfon the writer's 15 books, for which Halfon the writer received in 2018 the Guatemalan National Prize in Literature, his country's highest literary honor. And yet it may be more true to say that in Halfon's fiction and perhaps life, the body in motion, the nomadic body, the living body, the marked body, the body that remembers, that searches is the only nation there is, a borderless body politic spanning the globe, chasing and telling stories and thereby surviving, staying alive. Please join me in welcoming Eduardo Halfon.
Hello, hello everybody. Hi, Michael. Thank you, Michael, for having us here. Thank you, Alan. Fernanda, un placer y un honor estar contigo. So I'm going to read a fragment of my new book, which is not yet published in English. It's called Canción. This is Canción in Spanish. And I'll read a fragment that was published in English that I wrote in English, actually, and then translated to Spanish. Long story. And it begins in Spanish like this. Le decían canción porque había sido carnicero. And now I'll read it in English. They called him Canción because he used to be a butcher. Not because he was a musician, not because he was a singer, couldn't even sing, but because when he got out of jail in Puerto Barrios, where he'd been sent for holding up a gas station, he worked for a time in Doña Susana's meat shop in a rundown neighborhood of Guatemala City. They say he was a good butcher, very kind with the ladies from the neighborhood who bought cuts of beef and sausages there. And his nickname then was nothing more than an alliteration between the words in Spanish for butcher, carnicero, and song, canción. Or at least that's what some of his friends claimed. Others, however, said that he got his nickname thanks to his peculiar and melodic way of talking. And still others, perhaps the most intrepid ones, attributed it to his capricious nature of always confessing too much, of singing more than he should. His closest friends, his comrades, called him Ricardo, but his name was Percy. Percy Amilcar Jacobs Fernandez. It was he, Percy, or Ricardo, or Canción, who a few years after working as a butcher, kidnapped my grandfather. I arrived too early. I walked up to the counter and said hello to the waiter, an elderly gentleman dressed in a white shirt and black pants who had probably been there his entire life, behind that same counter, preparing drinks for those same clients. What can I get you, caballero? I was surprised I'd heard him. He mumbled without opening his mouth, like a ventriloquist, until I noticed that in the bar reigned an almost sepulchral silence. No music, very few and solitary patrons. I ordered a negra modelo and went to wait for it at the table farthest away from a soundless television that hung from the ceiling. At the table next to me, two men were sharing a bottle of rum and a bowl of potato chips. At another table, an older woman, wearing a miniskirt and way too much lipstick, was eyeing a newspaper with little or no interest, perhaps just looking at the photos. At another table, a man in a coat and tie, typically worn by a frustrated notary, was holding with both hands his glass of whiskey, almost clinging to his glass of whiskey, while he observed me with a serious and indiscreet expression. I noticed that behind the bar, inside an old wooden bookcase with glass doors, there was a series of diplomas and gold medals and large silver trophies and a small taxidermized ocelot about to attack. Far away at the other end of the bar were two swinging doors of the bathrooms. The men's, marked by an old magazine cutout of a young and dusty Clint Eastwood. The women's, marked by an old magazine cutout of a loud and bosomy Marilyn Monroe. Through the large window, I could see the silhouettes and lights of the downtown traffic. It was beginning to get dark. I pulled close to the small ashtray that was on the table, lit a cigarette, and stared anxiously at the front door, thinking all the while that a bar located on the corner of a round building is surely a metaphor of something. I was born in a dead-end street. That is, when I was born in 1971, my parents lived in a new house on a dead-end street. At the entrance of the street on Avenida Reforma, there used to be a famous ice cream parlor on one corner and a not-so-famous metal merchant's on the other. I have no memories of that dead-end street, of course, but there exist several silent home movies that serve as evidence of my first years there. Me, as a newborn in my mother's arms, coming home from the hospital in a jade-colored Volvo. Me, as a 1-year-old, sitting inside a wooden cart painted sky blue while a black goat gives me a ride up and down the street, and an indigenous boy, barefoot and dressed in rags, guides the black goat with a thin lasso, a typical entertainment of that time for the birthday parties of the wealthier kids. Me, as a 2-year-old, spinning in circles in front of the metal merchants with my face slathered in tangerine sorbet, and then, in a foreshadowing of many dizzy spells that were to come, throwing up a tangerine stream all over the curb. Me, as a 3-year-old, playing with the neighbor's dog, a plump and lazy dachshund named Sancho. And even though there's no silent home movie of it, on a cold January morning of 1967, 4 years before I was born, and while our future house was still under construction, a police car stopping my Lebanese grandfather at the entrance of the dead-end street on the corner of Avenida Reforma to kidnap him. The waiter arrived. He placed on the table a Negra Modelo in a huge frozen mug, and I asked him if he couldn't bring me a small glass instead. The old waiter made a gesture with his face, one of frustration or maybe bewilderment. I was forced to explain to him that I like to drink dark beer slowly, pouring myself one sip at a time in a small glass, whether it be a tumbler or a goblet or a rocks or an old-fashioned. I then thought of telling him to please hurry, since I like to alternate small sips of dark beer with quick drags of my cigarette, although I've never been quite sure if it's a matter of enjoying the bitter taste in my mouth or perhaps of superstition. I then thought of telling him that the history of my life had somehow become irredeemably intertwined with my history of beer and cigarettes. But I remained silent, and the old waiter just made another gesture, only this time a gesture with his entire face, an exaggerated, almost buffoon-like gesture, as if saying, "It's up to you, caballero, but only a madman drinks his beer that way." He snatched the frozen mug from the table and walked back to the counter, dragging his feet. And I became suddenly excited as I saw out of the corner of my eye that someone had pushed open the front door. Only a boy carrying a flimsy cardboard box. He was selling green parrots. Inside the police car, parked and waiting for my grandfather at the corner of the dead-end street on that cold morning in January of 1967, there were 4 men. One was half asleep in the back seat with a white towel rolled around his neck like a thick scarf. Next to him, another man was cleaning the window with a page from an old newspaper. Another man, the driver, waited in silence with the engine turned on, his hands gripping the steering wheel far too tightly. And another man was ready to jump out of the passenger door as soon as he saw in the rearview mirror the cream-colored Mercedes approaching on Avenida Reforma. Of the 4 men, only one would survive the Civil War. My grandfather awoke before sunrise. He was anxious, as if he somehow knew what the day held in store for him. He took a shower and got dressed slowly, silently, so as not to wake my grandmother. He went down to the dining room and ate breakfast by himself. After making a phone call, he got into his cream-colored Mercedes, turned on the engine, and exited through the main gate. It was still early in the morning. The dew and January cold had not yet lifted, My grandfather reached the bank too soon. It was still closed, and he had to wait outside, standing in an almost deserted street. When it finally opened, my grandfather conducted his business angrily, the teller would later state, and went back out to his cream-colored Mercedes. He drove diligently. Inside one of his front pockets of his trousers was the thick wad of bills he'd just withdrawn at the bank, the equivalent of $2,500, to pay the construction workers their 2 weeks' salaries. Inside the other front pocket of his trousers was his bank booklet with all of his financial information and the actual account balance. In his coat's inside pocket were 2 gold-plated pens. And on his pinky finger, as always, he was wearing his ring encrusted with a 3-carat diamond. He reached the dead-end street on Avenida Reforma. There was a police car parked in the entrance, blocking his way. One of the policemen was already standing outside on the curb and motioned for him to stop and get out of the car. I was pouring myself another drink of dark beer in the small glass when someone pushed open the front door and came into the bar. Just a young guy. He was wearing what looked like a school uniform, but a school uniform at the end of the day, all ruffled and untidy. He walked straight toward the older woman in a miniskirt, and after whispering in her ear something I couldn't quite make out, he placed a few bills on the table. It occurred to me that he was there to pay her tab. Maybe she was his mother or his grandmother. But she just picked up the bills without even looking up from the newspaper and stuffed them inside her bra. He was still standing beside her, his head bent low, as if he had been chided, when suddenly someone much younger, a teenager, entered the bar and stood behind him, as if waiting his turn. The first guy ambled out of the bar. Hesitantly, the second guy took a step forward. He also whispered something unintelligible into her ear. He also placed a handful of bills on the table, and the old woman, without saying anything, without even looking up, also shoved them into her bra. Tiburon, shark. The name given by the guerrillas of the armed rebel forces to the police car used that cold January morning for the kidnapping of my grandfather. Or rather, the name given to the car they used as a police car. It had belonged to the government's Secretary of Information, Baltasar Morales de la Cruz, who had been kidnapped a few months earlier. His son, Luis Fernando, was killed in the shootout, as was his driver, Chabelo. The guerrillas had arrived in a blue truck to kidnap Morales de la Cruz, but it had stalled in the getaway. So they decided to leave the blue truck behind and take Morales de la Cruz in his own car, a 1964 chalk white Chrysler Imperial Crown. A few months later, that same Chrysler was painted gray and disguised as a police car and as a shark, and lying in wait at the entrance of the dead-end street to kidnap my grandfather. A middle-aged man stood in the night on the other side of the glass door. He was dressed entirely in black and was staring at each of us inside the bar, as if searching for someone. He then closed his eyes and raised a book high with his right hand. "Sinners!" he yelled with rage through the glass, his eyes still closed. He yelled out something else, a slow, lingering sentence, perhaps a biblical quote that I didn't understand through the glass door, or that I didn't want to understand through the glass door, and he fell silent. He was swaying back and forth. He looked as if he was praying wordlessly. Nobody else in the bar seemed to notice him or even acknowledge his presence on the other side of the glass door, and it occurred to me that he too arrived there every night, that he too every night was another regular of the bar. Suddenly, with the book still held high and his eyes still closed, the man leaned forward and placed his lips on the glass, as if kissing the glass, or as if kissing all of us sinners inside the bar. My grandfather got out of his cream-colored Mercedes. He didn't turn off the engine, didn't shut the door, didn't even bother to park it properly on the side of Avenida Reforma, in front of the famous ice cream parlor. It was still early in the morning. There were few cars or pedestrians about. The policeman approached him, and my grandfather, perhaps because he noticed the policeman's childish face, or perhaps because he noticed that his uniform fit him comically large, started speaking to him in an insolent manner. "Move that patrol car," waving his index finger. "Don't touch me," snapping back his arm. But the officer simply told him in a calm voice that he had a warrant for his arrest, for contraband. My grandfather, who spoke loudly and brusquely to everyone with his heavy Arabic accent, started speaking even more loudly and more brusquely to the policeman with a childlike demeanor who didn't want to or couldn't give him a clear explanation, and who refused to show my grandfather the supposed arrest warrant. But suddenly, the policeman said something to him in a whisper, his words barely a curl of white smoke, and my grandfather walked with him over to the police car and obediently got into the back seat. And sitting there between two other policemen, the last thing he saw out of the window was his daughter, my father's oldest sister, racing toward the car. Then everything went black. The two men at the table next to mine called over the waiter and ordered another eighth of rum. Their faces were red and sweaty. One of the men, his head bent low, seemed about to fall asleep. The other man was holding the empty bottle in his hands, almost caressing it with sadness or longing. I noticed that there was another empty eighth of rum on the table and thought of asking them why they hadn't initially just ordered a large bottle instead of drinking small eighths of a liter, but I preferred to guess. Option A, the two men, when they arrived at the bar, planned to drink only an eighth between them, but then, feeling the beginnings of a rum-induced fever, decided to prolong the night and share a second eighth, then a third. Option B, the two men, when they arrived at the bar, had asked the barman for a liter of rum, but had been told that unfortunately there were no liter bottles of rum left, just eighths of a liter. Option C, the two men were of the philosophy that rum tastes better in servings of 125 milliliters. Option D, the two men had no philosophy or project whatsoever and simply drank rum with the levity of two blind men standing at the edge of an abyss. And as I was trying to come up with a fifth option to explain drinking rum in that manner, the man who was about to fall asleep lifted his gaze up toward me, a teary, milky gaze, and spouted, "Get the devil out of that fucking thing." It took me a few seconds to realize that he wasn't looking at me or talking to me. The other man, the one who was holding the empty bottle, reached out his other hand and grabbed a lighter from the table, and after lighting it, held the flame to the bottom of the bottle, as if heating it up. Then, carefully, he held the flame at the mouth of the bottle. From the opening shot out a blue, malignant blaze. My grandfather had telephoned his oldest daughter that morning, just before leaving the house, to tell her to meet him at the construction site, that he wanted to show her how the work was going. And so, as she waited there, standing in the dead-end street, she saw from afar how her father had left the cream-colored Mercedes badly parked on the side road of Avenida Reforma, the engine still running, the door half open. How her father yelled and argued with one of the policemen. How that same policeman then whispered something that she couldn't hear. She just saw the white mist of the words, but which immediately silenced her father. And without even thinking about it, she had started running down the street toward them. Now she was standing in front of the patrol car, defying the policemen, insulting the policemen, shouting at them that she refused to move out of the way until they explained to her why they were taking her father, why the black hood over his head. One of the policemen opened his door. He got out slowly. Just as slowly and barely smiling, he pointed his machine gun at her. "Move, lady, or I'll rip you in two." The policeman, impeccably disguised as a policeman, was Cancion.
Excellent. Thank you so much for leaving us in some suspense there. It's I can't wait to read the book. And thank you, Fernanda, for that fantastic reading as well. I'm going to start the Q&A with maybe a couple of questions, but again, encourage the audience to please go ahead and submit some questions via the Q&As, and we'll keep an eye on that and get to those as well. But I wanted to start Eduardo, just sort of thinking about, and I know we sort of talked about this before, like, you know, a couple of moments from the story Lejano from Polish Boxer that have stuck with me, I think in part because that was my first encounter with your work. And the moments I'm thinking of are when Halfon, the narrator, makes that connection between Juan Calel's scar, right, the indigenous student at the university, his scar and his memory of his father's time in Auschwitz. And then later, when Calel disappears from the university, going to, you know, sort of ask for information on him that he can't access, not because of as we would today, like FERPA questions, like, you know, privacy issues, but because he's been eradicated, right? I mean, that phrase, as Halfon says, is as though he never existed, right? Sort of like putting us, you know, again, making that connection. And so I guess I'm sort of interested in the ways in which these conjunctions that occur frequently throughout your work maybe start to move past a personal history, Halfon's personal history, into a way of thinking about, you know, the connection between Guatemala and Latin America in general, and a much larger history of oppression and, you know, and the mourning that accompanies it, right? I mean, or grieving, that, as to use Cristina Rivera Garza's term.
Mhm. Well, that's a complex starting point, Michael. Yeah. Yeah, my relationship with Guatemala has been a very tricky one. I could say that started when I left. You know, we left Guatemala in 1981 when I was 10, as you mentioned, I think, in the intro, and I grew up in Florida. But even before that, even in the 70s, while I was growing up, it was a very strange place to be for me, because I was the only Jewish kid in a sea of Catholics. so I was always, the analogy I like to use is I was allowed to watch the game from the sidelines, but not play. So all of my friends had their first communion. All of my friends had Christmas. All of my friends ate for el primero de noviembre, you know, for Dia de los Muertos, they ate fiambre. When you live in a place where everything is revolves around the Catholic calendar, I mean, even the school year, the holidays, and you are not allowed to take part in that, it's very strange for a kid. So I've always had this sense of not belonging in Guatemala, of not being there. Then I'll move forward quickly to Juan Calel. Juan Calel was a student that appeared in this story as a metaphor, or as a touchstone. I'm not sure how to describe him. He was the only indigenous student in a very private university. So the university would give one scholarship per year to a needy indigenous kid. And so he arrived, and the system expelled him. The system pushed him out. And as I mentioned yesterday in our talk, when I wrote that story, it was my way of almost saying goodbye to Guatemala. I left after I wrote that story. I left for Spain, and then to Nebraska, and then to Iowa, now in France. But something happened in me when I wrote that story. I saw something that I didn't like. Yeah, and there was only that option left for me. So that scar on his face, although it's just a line or two in the story, is very significant. It's very significant. It's very significant at the end as well. I don't want to dwell on that because there's people who haven't read the story with us. But it was very important for me as a writer, and it also talks about my relationship with the country, my relationship with teaching, as you know, and my relationship with writing, and deciding at that moment, 2007, to just write. To just write. I stopped teaching and I've been writing ever since. Financially difficult, but but possible.
It's interesting. I mean, you know, in the sense in the story, of course, is that Khaled's choice is Khaled's disappearance is a choice, right? As opposed to the expulsion or the sort of expungement that
Yeah.
seems to have happened in the real world. So it's you know, I think it speaks interestingly to that the power of the writing as well.
Yeah.
To sort of, you know, address these things.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's a choice motivated by the system.
Mm.
It's the system that doesn't allow that type of student, you know, because of all of the connotations and all the consequences of the system, of the way the system works in our countries in Latin America. I don't want to say just Guatemala. I think this is a very general phenomenon of class,
yeah,
and which is intimately related with race in Guatemala, and what that means. And Mexico también, no, Fernanda?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Fernanda, we've got a couple of questions directly for you, and I think let us try to address those. We've got Aristotle asking both Fernanda and Eduardo, in both your works, that there's such a presence of the communal voice and the voice of the people. So what is the importance of that voice to you both? What narrative role does that voice play?
When I was creating Hurricane Season, when the first idea of it came to me, I start hearing voices. Wonderful writer, Mexican writer Sergio Pitol used to say that a writer is someone whose head is filled with voices. Someone who will wake up in the morning and hear these voices, and that's why we writers are very close to being crazy. And so, you know, when I was writing Hurricane Season, what I heard the most were voices of women. I was trying to create or recreate a small rural town in the outskirts of Veracruz, in the sugar cane fields. And I was using all my knowledge of Veracruz and all my knowledge about little small town by a dirt road. And it was very natural how these voices of women came and start talking about the town, about its inhabitants, about the murder of the witch, about the witch herself, and also about her aggressors. And it was just, I just let it happen. And I thought that intuitively, the narrative voice, the predominant narrative voice, had to be that sort of women taking the word and contradicting each other and gossiping around. And I really wanted the main voice of the novel being like that, a feminine really strong voices of women. And I just had read the novel speech of from Svetlana Alexievich when she won the novel. And she said something beautiful about her being a child when she began to being interested in telling stories. She will remember that she'll wait outside the small little town where she lived with a bunch of children who just waited for the women of the town to get back from work, you know, from the fields, and they will sit there and smoke cigars and cigarettes, and they will just talk about what they lived during the war, and they will tell stories, and the children will listen to her. And I really try to reproduce that, because I really think it's important to give voice to other discourses that have been rejected by literature. You know, the discourse for me of the Nota Roja, for example, of you know, sensationalistic journalism, or of the judicial acts, you know, the judges' acts. I like to incorporate, to put to bring to literature a whole set of discourses that normally they wouldn't be accepted there. And I think it's a huge influence from Manuel Puig, who's an Argentinian writer that I love and who's always trying to use, high and lowbrow culture into this amazing work of arts.
Eduardo, how about you in terms of this notion of the communal voice?
For me, it's a little different, Michael, because since 2008, since I published El Boxeador Polaco, the Polish boxer, I've been writing in a very, very specific first-person voice. This other Eduardo Halfon, the name of that narrator, who's now been the voice for the last 6 books, which kind of make one big book. It's one big project that has been writing itself in front of me. I never expected that to happen, but and his voice is very particular. It's not my voice. His temperament is also not my temperament. He's a character, but it's a voice that comes from very, very from somewhere very, very intimate. So I would say it's even more intimate than my voice. My voice right now is a pose. I'm talking as a writer should talk, right? The guy in my story says things that I probably wouldn't say for whatever reason. Now, that's the narrator, but there are the other voices, the chorus of voices of the other characters that show up in my work. No, Canción, for example, in the new one, or my grandfather in the Polish boxer, the dialogue between the grandson and the grandfather in the Polish boxer. So their voices are also very interesting. Most of the characters' voice comes from somewhere or someone specific. But I think that has to do more with an intuitive reasoning than a rational one, and a lyrical, a sound to it. No, whether that narrator be my grandfather or a kidnapper, there is a cadence that I look for when writing other voices, a musical rhythm to it, which brings into question the translation of these voices for me. No, into English.
Yeah, so interesting that you say that. I mean, because definitely that cadence, the musicality of the work was very apparent in the reading in English that you just gave to you. So sort of thinking about the move back and forth between language that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. I'm very aware of that music. Yeah.
We've got another question here for Fernanda from Ricky, asking about the body of La Bruja and those of the other characters demonstrating the brutal intersections of misogyny and homophobia, and that he's curious if you might comment on the boundaries of gender performativity and perhaps how visibility and invisibility relate to the brutality.
This is a very interesting question. I don't normally think in my novels with this kind of language. I mean, it never, the subject for me or a theoretical interest, it never comes before. It's always the characters, and it's always something really, really instinctive for me. I will say that from the beginning, I wanted the character of the witch to have this mystery surrounding her. I wanted to construct in her symbolic presence and put all the fears and anxieties of a small town regarding women and regarding non-conforming genders in her. I constructed it in a way that at first she's like a mythical character, a character from a legend, and chapter after chapter, she becomes more human. She becomes more a person with virtues and defects, and for me, it was very important to her to be silent, for example, to not talk, because in the center of this crime that I wanted to explore, in the center of this crime motivated by misogyny, by homophobia, by like angst against a society that prevents young people from having a future. I wanted her to be in like the center of the hurricane with her aggressor, and that's why her and Luismi are not silent, and are silent. Pardon me. So I thought that each chapter, each character of a hurricane season must have a personal relationship with his or her own performativity. Let's say, for example, one of the characters that begin as just a innocent standby and then became more and more important while I was writing the book was Brando. And the thing with Brando was that he's a boy, he's a teenager, and he's just so afraid of his own desires that he cancels them, and he prefers to think he is possessed by the devil than to think that he desires other men. And society makes it his family, his mother, the people that surround him. For him, it's so impossible to be gay that he hates himself, and I just couldn't. For me, it was a nightmare, and I had to write him from that dilemma, because I cannot imagine a worse nightmare than to hate what you most desire, in yourself. And I just wanted to show, and through the language that is really crude and harsh, I wanted to show and make visible this violence that's always in Mexican way of being a man, and also the Mexican way of being a woman. These homophobic and misogynistic phrases that we all have heard and we maybe reproduce without even notice. So the thing with the language was another way for me to exploring these contradictions in the society, but also to expose them to the reader and confront the reader with these notions.
Excellent. We have reached 11 o'clock, just passed. So I think let's call it here for now and just take our hour break and then reconvene at the round table here at noon. So I appreciate again y'all coming, and to our audience, thank you so much, and I hope you can join us again here in about an hour at noon, and hopefully get a few more of these questions in. Thank you again, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you.